Welcome to Theory Neutral, the podcast about stuff languages do.
I'm Logan.
I'm Jacob.
And I'm Aiden. And today we are talking about serial verb constructions, a paper by Aikhenvald on serial verb typology called Serial Verb Constructions in Typological Perspective. I think it's the intro to a larger volume talking about serial verbs, but it's a nice, good overview of serial verbs in general, what they are, how they work, different ways they can be done. It's very comprehensive.
Yeah, for an introduction, it's surprisingly long.
That's true.
This could have been published as a short book on Kindle Direct Publishing all by itself.
Yeah, it's like 75 pages.
So we're going to be doing an overview of the overview, or this would take hours.
There's a lot of good data in the paper. If you can get your hands on it, go read it. It's fantastic. So I guess we should start off by talking about what is a serial verb construction, given that it's a topic we don't talk about a lot in general intro linguistics things, in part because it's not super common in Europe, even though it is definitely a thing in English sometimes.
Which is kind of weird because isn't it oft propagated that linguists shouldn't focus as much on European languages, and then you go into a linguistics class and you don't talk about serial verb constructions because they are not in Europe.
Yes.
It's a bit of cultural inertia.
For sure. I mean, I think some of it is like intro to linguistics classes tend to focus on things that students are already going to be a little familiar with so that they can understand the concepts, which is fair, but like eventually you got to talk about the stuff you're not familiar with, or the stuff you didn't think you were going to be familiar with, like serial verb constructions, which again happen in English. A serial verb construction is basically a sequence of verbs that look like they could stand alone, but they don't. Together they form a single unit predicate. They're not separate conjoined predicates. They're not sequenced. For syntactic purposes, at least, they are a unit. And everything in the syntax says this is just a verb. It's just that when you look inside it, there's actually more than one verb in there that all look like they could be the heads of their own clauses. English does this sometimes with, there's only a few verbs that you can sort of use this construction with, and it doesn't work when you start trying to add tense information. But the example that I always like is, would you go run take back down that sign? Where go run take is a serial verb construction with 3 verbs in it.
And you could even make it longer. Would you go hurry run take back down the sign?
Yeah, I don't know that I could say that, but you may be able to say it in your English.
Yeah, that works for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't have native intuition, so I don't know.
I've had people complain and say, no, you can't. You can only do go take back down that sign or run take back down that sign. You can't do both, and I can totally do both. So
it's clearly a very dialect-specific, non-standard thing in any case, but that is not the case in other languages.
No,
exactly.
Not at all. Yeah, so you can see what's going on there is that you've got verbs that are all together forming a single picture of a single event. In this case, go, run, take is like go somewhere else, do it quickly, and then whatever semantics take has in this context. And it's all one unit. It's conceiving a single event. Each verb could stand on its own in this form. You could say, would you go? Would you take? Would you run? All of those work on their own. It's just that we've strung them all together in a sequence. That is what a serial verb construction is. And Englishes are new, and you can't do everything you could to a normal verb in them. Like if you try and put past tense on that, he went, ran, took back down the sign. Like it's you start to...
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, it starts to fall apart.
And it sounds kind of funny.
But other languages totally let you do this, and that's what we're going to talk about. There's a bunch of different things that serial verb constructions can do. One of the sort of basic ones is to describe like actions in a sequence. Often the examples that you see are from languages like some West African languages where you say break something by hitting, you say hit X break. You serialize hit and break together so you have a single event of hitting and then causing to break. Other things they can be used for is they can describe manners and interrelated effects, like in the English construction where like run adds the sense of doing it quickly, getting it knocked out very soon. They can be used to introduce arguments. So you can say, I will use brush, write letter, as a serial verb construction in some languages, which means, like what in English we would say, write the letter with a brush. So they can add arguments that way. Sometimes they can do other things with arguments, which we may get to talk about. And sometimes there's just pure lexical idioms where these verbs have been serialized, and now they're kind of a unit together, and the meaning isn't really compositional anymore, but it's still structurally a serial verb construction.
And also, there is sometimes pretty interesting cases in which a language or a speaker of a language prefers a serial verb constructions over something like a coordinative construction. For example, I've read this example from Tariana, which is also a language that Aikhenvald, the author of that paper, has done fieldwork on, where there was a specific serial verb constructions for the act of, I think it was brewing manioc beer, or something like that, which was super interesting because it was like essential to that culture. And it was like some serial verb constructions with like to, spit out, and make bad, or something like that. Super interesting that I think in that context, the speaker would not have chosen the coordinate construction or the non-serial construction because they consider that action of brewing manioc beer to be like one unit. So it's also like not only syntactically a single predicate, but also semantically and pragmatically considered a single action.
Yeah, there's some significant cultural considerations as to what counts as a single action and how that's all conceived that we're going to talk about later.
And listeners may recall from our last episode on coordination, it is possible to do coordination with no overt marking. So you could get coordinated verbs that on the surface are just a verb followed by a verb followed by a verb, but that's not necessarily the same thing as serialization, because languages that have serialization have a semantic distinction between a series of coordinated verbs and actually serialized verbs. And there are some examples in the paper where interpreting a serial as a coordination or transforming the same set of verbs from a serial construction into an explicitly coordinated construction actually radically changes the meaning and sometimes produces really weird, semantically humorous results.
Yes. I can definitely imagine a case where you have sort of a borderline serialization construction where it can you can analyze it as serialization, or you can analyze it as like zero coordination. Just kind of like this paper talks about situations where it's not clear if something is an auxiliary verb construction or a serial verb construction. But nonetheless, the core case of serialization is very clearly distinct from coordination. It's not a case of we're just not putting overt coordination markers in here, but it's, it's still the same thing. It's like, no, these are behaving as a unit in a way coordination never actually does.
Now, having listed all of the things that serialization can be used for, I think it's worth pointing out that this is not like a unified semantic category, which can make serialization really hard to identify, especially when you're trying to pick apart, is it serialization, or is it auxiliaries, or is it serialization, or is it zero coordination? Because the semantic range of serialization is just so huge, and that's part of what makes this paper so dang long. There's just so much to talk about, and if you can think of a possible meaning that a serialized construction might have, then it will probably exist in some language somewhere. To the point where I feel like it's almost more useful to reverse our tagline here and try to talk a little bit about what languages don't do. Because there are some things that don't get encoded by serialization. That might actually be more informative as we go through the paper to point those out. What are the things that don't happen?
One potential way of sort of unifying a little bit of the idea of serialization, and this might turn out to be wrong, but how I have seen it presented is, technically this is in the framework of Roland reference grammar, which is a particular niche syntactic theory that I've got some training in, and kind of like, Roland reference grammar is all about continua, And so one of the continua that it sets up is level of verb connection in various kinds of ways you can connect meanings of different verbs together, all the way from things like very, very direct causation of like, these are basically the same action, it's just two different parts of that action, all the way to, I told him to do a thing and then he went and did the thing. And I don't remember exactly the ends, but the idea is that serialization is much more likely to be farther towards the close connection end of that scale. It may extend up fairly high towards very sort of disparate actions, but the core idea of serialization is that it starts fairly low on that continuum towards the side of very closely connected verbal action. And so a lot of the things we're going to be talking about is a lot of the ways that it can be used are much closer to that end of very closely connected verbal action rather than incidentally connected verbal action. Verbal action that's connected because we said so, kind of a thing.
Yeah, and that also leads over to my next point, which is some properties / parameters of serial verb constructions, which are nice to have to describe serial verb constructions, and also because you just mentioned like this being a unit, this unifiedness. I'm not sure whether that word exists, but sure. I'm just going to neologize it. Well, there is the parameter, the property of contiguity, which basically means is the serial verb constructions, is the predicate interrupted by like an object or an adverb or something like that, or can it not be interrupted? And that's basically the point of contiguity, which is pretty self-explanatory actually. It's not that difficult. Also interesting, what about incorporation? When a noun gets incorporated into a verb and then you have a serial verb constructions, well, can it be analyzed as being contiguous or is it non-contiguous because the incorporated noun actually forms part of the stem, but it's still something that intervenes inside of the serial verb construction? That's like a point of discussion there. There's also the parameter of composition, which we will talk about later actually in more greater detail. So just so that you have heard the two terms, the distinctions which we talk about when talking about composition is between symmetrical and asymmetrical serial verb constructions. So that's pretty interesting. We're going to talk about that later because that's a huge topic actually. There is the word hookup components. Is a serial verb constructions encoded by a single word? Is it a multiple word construction? So sometimes you have stuff like root serialization, which means that you have very synthetic ordering the roots of the different verbs next to each other, and that's super language specific. So you can't really say, okay, serial verb constructions are generally multi-word. That's not something you can say because like the whole parameter of what is a word differs from language to language. So for example, there's R.W. Dixon's Basic Linguistic Theory, which is pretty cool. I've read it several times, and it talks about words like wordhood and basically distinguishes phonological and grammatical words, which are concepts that do appear cross-linguistically, but how they are realized totally depends on language.
It's one of the dirty secrets of linguistics that none of us actually know what a word is.
Exactly. What is a word? What is a word? Yeah. So that's one of the parameters. Is the SVC a single word or is it composed of several words? And obviously that implies what Logan just said. What is a word? So that's an interesting point of debate. And also there's a specific section in the paper about the interaction of contiguity and wordhood, which is a pretty interesting combination because apparently there are languages that combine non-contiguous with multi-word SVCs, which like for example airway or Thai. Then there's contiguous SVCs that are also multi-word, like in Tariana. There's contiguous one-word SVCs like in Igbo. And then there's a fourth possibility, which has not been attested, which is non-contiguous one word. So basically, you can imagine something like that being a very, almost, maybe even polysynthetic language, even though that term is very disputed, as we might know.
I can't imagine that. Like,
yeah.
How can you have one word that isn't contiguous?
Exactly. It sounds super weird.
I just admitted I don't know what a word is, but
yeah.
Being contiguous feels pretty fundamental.
Yeah, it seems pretty impossible.
I'd imagine it depends on what they define by contiguity. Because I can imagine a situation where you have what looks like incorporated objects, where, you're allowed to have objects in the middle of your SVC, maybe not other things, and that's all still one word, because the object just becomes part of the same word as the rest of the serial
Exactly.
verb.
So it's interesting that it hasn't been attested yet, but I'm wondering, maybe it's something interesting you could incorporate in Conning, for example. Just like those typological rarities, or maybe not even rarities, it just simply doesn't exist yet. Well, it hasn't been attested yet. So it would be interesting to incorporate that into conlang, just to get this small conlanging flair into this episode. And there's also a fourth parameter, which is marking of grammatical categories, like of TAM categories, for example. They can be pretty distinct, There can be optional marking, concordant marking, single marking, and that's basically it for the parameters.
So one of the other properties that we talked about earlier, or one of the core ideas of a serial verb construction, is that they're semantically distinct from coordinated verbs. Exactly where the line is between things handled by coordination versus things handled by serialization depends on your language in question, but they are distinct. Another property that is worth mentioning is that most or all verbal categories are shared across all verbs within the construction, especially as you get towards sort of more clause level things like tense and mood, polarity. Those sorts of things usually are shared by the entire construction. There may be some lower level like aspect things that may be per verb. You can sometimes get polarity per verb in some languages, but generally you are having one setting for the entire construction because, again, it's one unit. And again, whether this is marked on all the verbs or one of the verbs, or your language just can mark the whole construction as a thing because it uses some other way to do that. All of that is language specific, but you're never going to get a serial verb construction where you have different tenses or different moods on different parts of the serial verb. That's not serialization at that point. And another result of this conceptual unity of all of the verbs in a serialization construction is that you cannot extract individual ones and then ask questions about them.
That's one of the really useful features, I think, for identifying serial verb constructions in a particular language, because in surface form, they can overlap with a lot of other things that can look the same. So you've really got to look at them in a discourse context and try to access how people are thinking about it. And can I ask a question about this thing is a really easy way to do that.
Yes, it very much is. They behave as an inseparable unit for information structure purposes as well. If you've got focus on your verb, as it were, it's going to be across the whole thing. You can't individually focus a part of a serial verb construction, because if you can't question it, then you can't focus it.
So moving on to what I referenced earlier, which was person marking. There are 5 categories which a person marking might occur in serial verb constructions, and they are pretty interesting, not gonna lie. Well, the first one is pretty straightforward. It's called concordant marking of the same subject. You just have the verbs, and then you have the marking of the subject, which is the same subject, just on each verb, for example, the same suffix. But then the next type is where it gets spicy already, called concordant marking of different underlying subjects. Before I explain that, let me just quickly refer to that example from akan or whatever, where the phrase I pour corn into water is literally translated as I pour corn, I flow in water. So basically, you have different underlying subjects. You have underlyingly, the first subject of pour is I, and flow into, the subject is corn. But on the surface form, both times you have the first person singular form of the verb. So it's mere aburo migu nsum, which is mere and migu is both first person singular, which is super just crazy. I remember I was researching, I think this book on serial verb constructions was one of the first linguistics paper I had ever read. And I remember distinctly reading that paper, and I was like super slow because I had never read like academic linguistic language before. I was quite struggling, to be honest. And so I was reading that example. I just couldn't grasp it, because why on earth is there a first person singular if the underlying subject is actually something else? And I suppose the reasoning behind that is just you have this unit. I mean, we're talking a lot about units today, but this unit of this one predicate, and you have to have the same subject. So I suppose it just makes sense to use the same subject, and the subject kind of spreads across the predicate because it's one predicate.
Yeah.
So it can't have two different subjects within one predicate. I think that's the reasoning behind it.
The idea is the predicate has one subject marking, and that subject is me. And, oh dear, we have two verbs in this predicate, and they both have to take subject marking. Well, they're going to be both marked for the subject of the whole predicate, even though if you break it down, that doesn't actually make sense because the second verb is something entirely different.
Yeah.
That is a really good example of something called switch function serialization, because sometimes different verbs in a serialized chain will all share the same arguments in the same roles, which makes a whole lot of sense, but they don't actually have to. They can share arguments or not share arguments in a bunch of different ways. Again, as I said earlier, if you can think of a possible semantics for a serial verb construction, some language probably does it. But yeah, one of those in particular, which Aikhenvald calls switch function serialization, is where the object of one root becomes the subject of the next one in the chain. Which sounds like that's what's going on here.
Exactly. So moving on, the next type, the third type, is, well, it's special. I consider it not strange, but it's definitely interesting, but not as strange as the second one, which is truncated same subject marking, which is, to put it in a nutshell, you have one verb where there's a normal person marker, and then on the other verb of the serial verb construction, you have a truncated variant of that person marker. So it's just a shortened indicator, which apparently happens in Dravidian languages. And next one, optional concordant subject marking, which is also, well, it makes sense, definitely. It basically means that either you can mark the subject on both verbs or only on one. And in some languages, there's a syntactic or a semantic reasoning behind whether to use a concordant marking or a just single marking. Like here it says in Gömai, single marking is obligatory for set one pronouns, that is first person singular, third person plural, and logophoric a, and optional concordant marking, which is what I just described, is used for other person number combinations. So I suppose optional concordant marking is very interesting because also the reasoning behind why you would choose optional marking as opposed to a single marking variant. You can have fun with that, you know?
If there's a distinction in form, somebody is going to apply a distinction in meaning.
Exactly. One further category that I don't think Aikhenvald mentions because it's kind of, I imagine it's fairly uncommon, is where the verbs just don't have person marking, period, in this language. Right. And so there's not person marking on one or person marking on, like, all of them. It's just none of them would ever have person marking in the first place, so you just don't mark it. Like, that's another category, I imagine. Yeah. And also, the last one, just to finish my monologue about person marking, that's just single marking. It's just one marker on one verb of the construction and the other verb doesn't take person marking. And I think that's also a way for other inflectional categories to be marked. Just, for example, you have, I don't know, negation marking maybe. Do you have negation marking on the first verb of the serial verb construction but not on the second one? Or maybe you just have the first verb absorbs all the inflection of the entire serial verb construction and all the other verbs are just infinitive. Mm-hmm. Or plain unmarked or whatever.
Yeah, plain unmarked.
Since I mentioned switch function a minute ago, let's talk a little bit about argument sharing generally, because this is a common feature of serial verb constructions. If you've got a multi-verb description of a single event, the different verbs that are describing that event are probably going to share common arguments that are participants in that event. So argument sharing between the components of a serial verb construction is typical, but what I found very surprising, just because this makes sense, like, yeah, it should work that way, it's apparently not always necessary. And just reading the line that it's typical but not necessary just blew my mind. Like, how could you possibly have serial verbs that don't share any arguments and still get interpreted as serial verbs? And then I saw the examples and I was like, oh, duh. This is totally retrospectively obvious. Of course it would work that way. But you can get event argument sharing and resultative serial verb constructions. So, for example, event sharing is basically where one verb is acting kind of adverbially for another one in the sequence.
I almost think of it as like one part of the serial verb construction takes the entire other part of the serial verb construction as its argument.
Yes.
So, like, I think one of the examples I give was, like, I counted it and it was enough, or something, where, like, your counting is enough.
Yeah, it's, you count the chickens correctly.
That's what it was, yes.
Literally, you count chickens, it be correct.
Yes.
But the original in Pamise is Kihulin ato kail hemal, where you've got basically Kihulin and then Hemal are the two serialized verbs, and they're discontiguous because the object of the first one comes in between them. But in English, we translate the verb to be correct as an adverb. You count the chickens correctly, and it's glossed as you count chickens, it be correct, as though this were a multi-clausal construction. But it's not multi-clausal, it's just there are two verbs, and the way that the argument sharing goes, the second one doesn't share any of the participant arguments of the first one. It just takes as its argument the event that is described by the first one.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's one way that you can have not sharing. It's kind of a cheat because, like, there is still a functional connection between the verbs.
Well, there's always a functional connection between the verbs, but yes.
Well, yeah. But then the other one is resultative serialization. There's an example here from Wotlap. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that language name correctly. This example is the only example of that language I have ever seen, but this example is "You stand black sun from me," which is translated as "standing as you are, you're hiding the sun from us," or literally, "You are standing dark the sun from us." And so the idea here is you've got stand and block the sun, and in the English translation, "you block the sun from us" shares a subject with "you stand," but apparently that's not what's happening here. It's like the argument structure of that particular verb is more passive-y, I guess. So it's saying the sun is blocked from us, the sun is black to us. That's one whole semantic unit. And then "you stand" is a separate unit, and those don't share any arguments at all, but they're connected because one of those situations causes the other one as a result. And that's what allows it to be serialized together.
Also, just looking at that particular example, just the gloss itself, without looking at the translation or the literal translation, reminds me a lot of depictive secondary predicates, where you have stuff like, I'm not sure whether it works in English because I'm not a native speaker, but something like, I bought the shop empty, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that works in English.
Yeah, I scraped the bowl clean.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Some also resultative, and also just reminded me, like the gloss, not the translation, but, you know, kind of got some similarities here in that particular example.
For sure.
So here's an example of something that languages don't do. If you allow non-sharing like this, that will not be the only kind of serialization that the language has. So the thing that languages don't do is allow serialization only in this form. If you have serialization at all, then your language will allow, at the very least, sharing a subject between component verbs in some construction, and then it may also do this kind of non-argument sharing thing as well, but never just the non-sharing thing. Another interesting thing about argument sharing is that the total set of participants in a serial verb construction is not always just like the set intersection or the sum of all of the arguments of the individual verbs. Sometimes putting a verb into a serial construction will cause one of its arguments to just get dropped. So there are some examples here from Igbo where if you put a ditransitive verb into a serial construction, one of its objects just goes away. I guess because, like, that's too many things to keep track of or something, maybe?
Yeah, you can't have two unmarked objects is fine. 3 unmarked objects is a little ridiculous.
Yeah, they don't want to figure out like how the sharing works out, so you just forget about one of them. So yeah, that's a thing that can happen. The argument structure of individual verbs can be changed when you put them into a larger serial construction. Another interesting thing that goes on here that's related to this resultative or event argument sharing is that what counts as a single event, what can be conceptualized as a single event that could be described by a serial verb construction, is extremely culturally specific. So there are plenty of examples of languages that seem to have very productive serialization constructions, which from a formal perspective, you could just put any old verb into, and like the syntax makes it clear this is a serial construction. But practically, there are significant limits on what actually gets serialized, because serializing certain things just doesn't make any sense. Because like that's not a single event in the minds of the speakers, so you wouldn't try to describe it that way. And I feel like it's difficult to explain how that works across different languages, because the same language spoken in different villages, if they have different local cultures, could end up looking like it has totally different grammatical constraints on SVCs. But really, it's not fundamentally a grammatical thing. It's like a cultural thing in terms of, do the people feel like it makes sense to describe this thing with an SVC? So Aikhenvald does a really good job, I think, of explaining how this works to English speakers, because we already said that, there are some English dialects that allow verb serialization, but it's not exactly standard. So the way that she tries to make this legible to the English-speaking audience is to say that things that can be expressed by serialization need to be name-worthy. So, like, in English, if you could come up with a compound noun to name a thing, then you could probably serialize it. And the main example here is that we have, in English, a standard compound, mountain climbing. Like, that's the name of a sport. People mountain climb.
Yeah.
And you could take that same syntax and try to put other stuff into it, but if I do that, it'll usually sound weird. So, like, ladder climbing isn't a thing. People climb ladders, but in English-speaking culture, like, ladder climbing is not a nameable event. So it's probably not something that you would express with a serial verb construction.
Exactly. And if you say, we're going to go ladder climbing, it's like, is that a thing? Is that a sport? That's what it sounds like.
And that's the same kind of like psychological double take that a speaker of one of these languages with SVC constructions would have if you put the wrong verbs in.
There's actually a nice example on page 11 from Alamblak, where you have a single word SVCs. I climbed the tree searching for insects. And for Alamblak speakers, that SVC is acceptable because it makes sense to them. And for us, non-native speakers of Alamblak, we can also think, okay, that makes sense, I guess, climbing the tree to search for insects, okay. But then I climbed the tree seeing the stars. The same language, just a bit different. That serial verb construction in Alamblak doesn't make sense. It's marked as infelicitous. Whereas, if you add an adverb, well, I climbed this tree seeing the stars clearly, that makes sense again, because, you can see the stars from the ground too. Moving on, I think I mentioned earlier the distinction between asymmetrical and symmetrical serial verb constructions. Asymmetrical consists of a major verb and a minor verb. And the major verb is basically any verb, and the minor verb is from a grammatically restricted or simply just closed class. So, for example, you could have a asymmetrical serial verb construction expressing aspect, and the minor verb refers, for example, completive aspect, and then it's like finish, and then you say, it finished rain. It was done raining. You have basically a verb that is chosen from a small class that indicates some grammatical category. Like, for example, here in the paper it says like direction, orientation, aspect, change of state.
Yeah, English's serial verb constructions are very much this, because the only verbs that you can use in them are like go and come, and for me, like run.
Exactly.
Run doesn't necessarily add quite as grammatical a category. It's more about sort of a general weird vague aspect thing. But again, that's it. You can't add any more verbs in that first serialization slot.
Exactly. And there's also some interesting stuff that I wouldn't have thought of. For example, valency, passives, applicatives, causatives can all be done with SVCs. For example, passive asymmetrical SVC introduced by to touch. So you would say something like the food touch eat, maybe, and the food was eaten. So asymmetrical constructions, you have a minor verb and a major verb, and those minor verbs can be grammaticalized pretty easily. So you can get maybe a direction, maybe associated motion, like the morphological direction marking, proclitic, or maybe even a prefix attaching to a verb, and the prefix originally was a minor verb indicating direction and stuff like that. You can basically take that grammaticalization path from asymmetrical constructions. And also another distinction is the distinction between asymmetrical constructions and auxiliary verb constructions. And you might not even call it a distinction because, well, I was wondering about that too, because I mentioned this was my first linguistics paper, and I've heard of auxiliary verbs because, you know, English class in Germany, you got auxiliary verbs. So I was wondering, what's the difference between asymmetrical SVCs and auxiliary verbs? And apparently that's not the distinction is not very clearly defined. It's very blurry. So you have basically terminological overlapping. So I think you can just decide what makes sense for you if you're the linguist describing the language. If you have other symmetrical constructions, you can say, okay, there's symmetrical SVCs and asymmetrical SVCs. But maybe you don't have symmetrical SVCs. So you could just say, okay, that's just an auxiliary verb. So I think that depends also on your background.
Yeah, it depends a lot on the language as well, because like Japanese is an example of a language that has both probably auxiliary verb constructions and something that looks a dang awful lot like serialization, even if it's not actually serialization. There's some morphological things that happen with it that don't happen with serialization in the core idea.
Yeah.
But otherwise, they look like serialization for all intents and purposes. And they behave very differently, and it's very clear which one is which. The serialization construction is much more connected. It results in one word. The auxiliary verb constructions are less obviously one word. They're less grammaticalized, and they make use of a different connector morphology that's much more clearly, that's sort of heavier. So within a language, it may be very clear to tell. But if you've only got one thing that looks like it could be either, then you've got a problem. Well, it's not a problem, but like can't put it in a box very well.
Conundrum.
Yes.
In the case of only having one thing, I feel like it could be largely a matter of scale. Like if you've got 3 closed class verbs that can be combined with other verbs, then it probably makes sense to call them auxiliaries. If you've got 40,
right,
then maybe it makes more sense to describe it as serialization.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean even then that it's a different thing. It's just like a choice of how do you most clearly communicate what's going on to other linguists.
Yep.
Exactly. So in contrast to asymmetrical constructions, there's also symmetrical constructions, which you can see like the terminology is pretty transparent. You have like asymmetrical, you have like one major verb and then one minor verb. So in symmetrical constructions, you have basically 2 major verbs. You have just 2 verbs, any 2 verbs that can be combined to have some constructed meaning. For example, you have sequence of actions. So you have this example from Airway, Amma will cook and eat. So just sequence. You have cause-effect stuff. You have manner stuff. So you kind of express adverbial meanings, like the child piled the soil around the banana tree badly. In that example, the badly is expressed by a serial verb construction of one verb meaning pile soil around and one verb meaning be bad. So that's how you can combine many verbs with each other without one belonging to a more specified class than another. You also have synonymous verb serialization,
yes.
Which basically you have 2 verbs with synonymous meanings, basically doing something like intensifying the meaning. So you have duration, like emphasizing the duration of an action, or here in White Hmong, you have a so-called elaborate expression. I'm not going to read out this text here because I don't speak Hmong.
Hmong's orthography is really unintuitive, so yeah.
But you have toil, bitter, toil, salty, which means to arduously toil. So that's pretty interesting. Having serial verb constructions consist of verbs that actually mean the same thing. Maybe they're just nearly synonymous, but they are somewhat synonymous. And then you have intensification of the original meaning. That's pretty cool, I think.
So the detailed descriptions of all of the things that asymmetrical and symmetrical constructions can do are really long, because together it's just the listing of all of the things that serial verb constructions can do. But there's a very convenient summary table, which for me made this whole section a whole lot easier to understand. And Aikhenvald breaks down the properties of asymmetrical versus symmetrical constructions in terms of semantics, constituent order, and grammaticalization. So for asymmetrical semantics, we've got aspectual, directional, modal, associative, and causative meanings. And for symmetrical semantics, we've got iconic sequencing, cause and effect, manner, and synonymy, or intensification. And then for constituent order, with asymmetrical, there's no fixed constituent order. It depends on the construction type. It'll vary between languages. But with symmetrical, some constructions will have a fixed constituent order and some won't. So sequential and cause and effect SVCs will have linear iconic order, and then manner SVCs will depend on the language. And then for grammaticalization, asymmetrical SVCs are much more likely to be grammaticalized, and symmetrical SVCs are much more likely to be lexicalized. So that's everything that serial verb constructions can do.
There's one last point which I'm going to talk about really briefly, which is, where do serial verb constructions actually occur geographically? Because it's certainly not very productively in Europe, but in other regions in the world that looks a bit different. So you have serial verb constructions as a prominent feature in Southeast Asia, which makes sense because we know Southeast Asia for their very isolating features, and it makes sense if you see like serial verb constructions without any morphology, like just verbs being serialized. But also, obviously, New Guinea, with some very synthetic languages, you can often find one-word SVCs.
Yeah, Yimas is a very famous example of...
Also, Alamblak is Papua New Guinean.
Yeah, serial verb constructions in Yimas can result in very long words. Not just because you've got, like, 3 verb roots in there, but also because you've got, like, a pile of extra morphology that also has to be on everything that's a verb.
There's also Karam, or Kalam, which is super cool, because I'm not sure whether you can consider it serialization. It was ages ago that I saw a screenshot of the grammar of Karam, where you had basically a verb sequence, but the verb sequence was nib, 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 dip, which the glass of which was eat, 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 finish. But the actual meaning was he ate and ate so much and then he finished. So that's also very interesting, and also from Papua New Guinea. So that's a very nice region to check out if you're into that kind of stuff. Also West Africa, also quite isolating as far as I know, like Southeast Asia, and Oceania. I'm not that well versed in Oceanian languages.
Depending on where you are, it's more or less isolating, but I think the ones that often have serial verb constructions are somewhat like, you still have maybe 3 or 4 morphemes per verb typically.
Interesting. Well, that's the regions in which serial verb constructions are most commonly encountered, and I think with that we can finish off our episode about serial verb constructions in typological perspective, and now we're going to do the outro. Theory Neutral is made possible by our listeners, families, and friends. Follow us on Twitter at theory_neutral, or send us an email at theory.neutral.podcast@gmail.com. Join us next time when we will be discussing nominal tense and cross-linguistic perspective.